everyone. I'm delighted to be on this Zoom. I am Ellen DuBois. I am a retired professor of history and gender studies at UCLA. And I am talking to Mir Yarfitz today. He is the author of Impure Migration, Jews and Sex Work in Golden Age Argentina. And I'm turning my book over to make sure I know who published it. Meanwhile, I will tell you, Rutgers University Press. Rutgers University Press. He is an associate professor at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he is a member of the history department, and he is currently serving as director of the Jewish Studies program. And there are thousands of other things to say about him, but I'm not going to do that. So I guess we'll get going. So I think you're going to start with a little presentation, correct? About your book before we have a conversation.
Yes, so great. Thank you, Ellen. And I also want to thank Sarah Stein and the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies for the invitation. Also, Chelsea White and David Wu for the tech support. And this is particularly exciting to me because I did my PhD at UCLA, so it feels like coming home virtually. Although, I guess I am technically always at home now. This is my dining room. But I'm also excited to have this conversation with Ellen DuBois, whose thinking on gender and transnational feminism, have really been influential to me for a very long time. So yeah, as Ellen says, I'll start with a brief presentation and then we will converse. We will be speaking about my book, Impure Migrations, 2019 Rutgers Jewish Cultures of the World series. Thank you. So yeah, and also for this audience, I wanted to give a little plug for a podcast that I did for Jason Lustig's Jewish History Matters series this past year. And in that podcast, I expanded the themes of the book into a broader contemporary conversation about racialization, gender, and immigration. So if you want more on contemporary connections, please check out the Jewish History Matters podcast. I think here we will mostly be focusing on history. So I'm going to share my screen and start us off. All right, Ellen, you see a full PowerPoint as it should look? Great.
Yes, I do.
So this is a project about the role of Ashkenazi Jews in what has been called international sex trafficking between the 1890s and the 1930s. And I trace international networks as well as ideas and focus on the place where this population and situation was most prevalent and well-known, Buenos Aires, right, the capital of Argentina. And the book turns several common ideas upside down, or at least kind of sideways, right, questioning if the usual version of the history of sex trafficking or Jewish community development is necessarily true, or if there might be other ways of looking at the historical evidence. And, just for a little bit of context, between the late 19th century and into the interwar period, Jewish migrants to Argentina from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa created the largest Jewish population concentration in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. And, they're often erased also in discussions of Argentine Jewry, who are usually kind of reflexively characterized as Ashkenazi. There is also a substantial Sephardi population, but the work of my book really focuses on the Ashkenazi population. There was a pretty sharp divide between the two. And Ashkenazim have been mostly excluded from the dominant form of labor in Eastern Europe, farming, right, and lacked the skills and experience to participate in the dominant sectors of the Argentine economy, agriculture, livestock raising. That's what drew most European migrants. And Jews were also, of course, excluded from many professions and generally from access to much education. So Ashkenazi job skills concentrated in urban artisanal fields, right, like tailoring, not quite enough demand for tailors in most New World cities to accommodate the level of migrant supply, with the exception of New York City's garment industry. So in Latin America, as they arrived, traditional avenues into the Latin American elite, the church, the military, land ownership, these all would have been closed to Jews. And just sort of budding professions were not particularly friendly to Jews. So Jews increasingly found their way into a range of occupations, right? And certainly over time, moved out of sex work. But at this time, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the organization and management of what was then largely legal sex work drew many Jewish men and women who had not a lot of other attractive options. And again, as more educational, professional, industrial options became available, they moved on. But in this period of mass migration, here as elsewhere, kind of gray zones of employment drew Jews along with other marginalized groups. Here's an image or a couple of police photos, sort of mugshots from the 1890s. And, there were, as it says here on this slide, sort of many Ashkenazim arrested as pimps in the 1890s in Buenos Aires. They certainly were not the only immigrants managing brothels and other spaces of assignation, but they were the most identifiable and, as we'll be discussing, the most tightly organized, right? And there was also a very strong connection in the popular imagination between Jews and sex work. In fact, so pervasive that you may have, if you're familiar with this region of the world, you may have heard that the word Polaka literally means Polish woman in Spanish. That term became used in both Argentina and Brazil to refer to all prostitutes, right? Literally meaning Jewish women from Poland. So at the heart of my book is a social history centered on what was initially called the Varsovia Israelite Mutual Aid and Burial Society, later changed its name to the Zvi Migdal Society. And this was a legal organization of Jewish pimps, brothel owners, and madams centered in Buenos Aires from its legal establishment in 1906 until a court case in 1930 when it was sort of broken apart. And this institution in 1930, at the time of these police raids, had over 400 members on its rolls. I have confirmed the scale of membership with this kind of annual financial report that was internally produced for its members shortly before that. So this organization was a mutual aid and burial society. It began in part as a way for Jews involved in sex work to bury their dead, since the other Jews refused to be buried next to them. And in addition to a cemetery, the organization developed other kinds of mutual aid benefits for members, from health insurance to support for kind of widows and orphans, right? It also circulated loans among members to develop properties into brothels in accordance with ongoing kind of regulatory restrictions. They held weddings and all kinds of parties inside this mansion. I'll show you inside in a little bit. And they even had at least one of their own synagogues, since they were barred from other spaces of worship. So I was going to talk a little bit about the title of the book, and so some of the words I chose, starting with the word impure. So in Argentina and around the world at this time, Jewish community leaders were really concerned and terrified that all Jews would be tied to sex work because it was so visible, particularly in situations like the Argentine one, and as well as aligning with anti-Semitic tropes. And they were worried that Jewish immigration and assimilation would be restricted. And as this local Jewish community began to grow, sort of mainstream Argentine Jewish leaders began to organize against Jewish sex work, and they made common cause in many cases with local and international reformers and authorities in this effort. And I mean, you could think about this really as a kind of boycott of people who they called the Tameim. So they used this word as a kind of in-group code to talk about the sort of folks in their midst who were involved in sex work. This literally means impure. I'm using kind of one of the Yiddish spellings here in the book. And, one of, so they forbid them to enter into Jewish spaces, both religious and cultural. Right? Burial societies and synagogues. So this is also part of the drive for Jews to organize themselves into their own burial society, their own synagogue, and so on. And they use this theoretically derived language of ritual purity to also promote a certain model of work and family. Right? Pretty homogeneous one. And I argue in the book that this battle played a key role in the foundational and long-term development of this new immigrant community's identity and institutional life in Argentina. There's a dialectical relationship here, right? So the Tameim, those labeled Tameim, then publicly declared their own Jewishness through their own synagogue events, holiday celebrations. They decorated their cemetery gate with a giant menorah. They owned extensive property in the heart of the central Jewish neighborhood. They fought for dominance of the Yiddish theater. So this was really a kind of battle for several decades that engaged central questions of Jewish identity, legitimacy, defined acceptable limits of work, of leisure, family structure, religious expression. And some of you may be interested in the Yiddish theater. The Yiddish theater was a site of particularly open conflict on this issue throughout the period. From the beginning, these were some of the wealthier Jews in town, and they provided financial backing as well as enthusiastic audience for Yiddish theatrical productions. Theater boxes and balconies were said to serve as sites of solicitation and assignation. And these are from some theater poster in the 1920s, the Excelsior Theater. This was at the time the most prominent Yiddish theater in Buenos Aires. And they issued these multicolored Spanish and Yiddish advertising posters. And what I want us to look at here is the different language that's printed in Spanish and English. In Spanish, it basically says, these are highly moral shows for families. The establishment reserves the right to refuse admission. In Yiddish, it just says, Tameim are forbidden to enter. So the difference in this text, printed in Spanish and English, really highlights the way in which this term, tameim, served as a kind of in-group code for discussing the problem of prostitution. And the Spanish that could be seen by the outside world was a little more ambiguous. Also, these sites were not solely of the underworld. Working class families with children came in for low-cost entertainment. They might or might not have had a problem with this sort of mixed clientele, who were their neighbors as well in the sort of central Jewish neighborhood at the time. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about the terms migration and sex work before we move on to our conversation. So I use the terms prostitution and sex work in the book somewhat interchangeably. Most people are more familiar with prostitution. I prefer the second term, deliberately chose it for the title, right? So, as you probably know, this term sex work in the 1970s. This was a political move, right? Insisting that this is a form of labor. It's not necessarily always a form of victimization or exploitation. And one of the starting points of my work follows from debates about this that have actually been happening for at least 150 years. I talk extensively about the late 19th century issue of so-called white slavery. At the time, already, people were debating if it always was about kidnapping, or if sometimes women just had really bad choices and chose what seemed to be the least bad to them. And that's generally the perspective I take in the book. In the 1970s, of course, feminists debated this hotly. Some continue today. For those who don't know, the two central positions are the sort of radical feminist position that prostitution is inherently always exploitative because of the dynamics of patriarchy. And then this sort of sex worker rights position, that the problem is the conditions under which the labor is performed. And the main dangers, are police, imprisonment of the wrong people. So, bringing this into the more present moment, things like FOSTA SESTA, getting rid of internet advertising, make it more dangerous for sex workers on the ground. And again, if you want to hear more about me talking about current stuff, listen to the Jewish History Matters podcast. So to sort of wrap up with this section, in the book, I follow scholars who argue that among limited options, most women historically made at least some of the decisions that led into sex work, right? Maybe not all of them. Maybe they didn't know exactly the full series of events that were going to be put in place when they, let's say, decided to leave their hometown in Eastern Europe. This is sometimes called modified choice theory. People make the best of a set of bad choices. And I don't want to minimize the question of violence. Certainly violence permeated this world. Violence, of course, also permeates the supposedly protected domestic sphere, certainly other arenas of women's labor. So if we follow this theoretical move of thinking about prostitution as sex work, then we can think about this period's international so-called sex traffic as a gendered labor phenomenon, really a way of interpreting a gendered part and women's part of this moment of mass migration, right? So if we think about prostitution as a form of labor, then this period's trafficking problem can be seen as a central part of the female side of this sort of massive migration out of industrializing and kind of war-torn Europe, right? Keeping in mind, we don't want to neutralize the violence by using the word migration. right? Migrating women and men faced different choices. They were affected differently by international relocation. Certainly, moral and physical risks for many migrant women would have been greater, labor opportunities fewer. And in general, labor demand and kind of restrictions would have meant that, particularly at the beginning of this period, circa 1900, selling sex was one of few available options for female migrants to make money in their new homes. Okay, so I told you I would take you into the Varsovia Society. So just for 1 minute, I'll take you in here. Um, this, as I said, was legally founded as a kind of immigrant voluntary association in 1906. Membership was entirely associated with the sex industry. The group held regular meetings to defend their interests against authorities. They moved women among brothels. They collectively coordinated importation of new sex workers from Europe into South America. They circulated capital loans for brothels and other properties. Here's some images from their cemetery. Again, and they actually did this together with the Sephardic and Mizrahi population, which was quite small. Those folks kind of needed the money to start their synagogue. The Ashkenazim, a little larger, didn't want to spend eternity next to pimps and prostitutes. You see, I don't know if you can see my mouse up here, and there's a menorah on the outside front of the gate, right? This is an image of the inside of their synagogue from the inside of that mansion. As you can see, there are pews. There's a stand with lions on the curtains that might traditionally hold a Torah scroll. I have found sources that suggest that they did hold religious services here. There's this internal financial report from 1926 that refers to Yom Kippur services. They also collected charitable donations there, as would have traditionally been done on Yom Kippur in a more normative space. Other images from inside a ballroom, a buffet bar, a courtyard garden, so very luxurious. And in the long term, the respectable Jews, we could say, are generally seen as having won this fight. That cemetery I showed you fell into ruins. This is what it later looked like. It's been kept closed and locked. It's very hard to get into. Their story has in many ways been contained or told in particular ways. I certainly spent years struggling to get archival access. Oral history certainly seemed out of the question. And just to wrap up with the breakup of the society in 1930, these are images. I used this image on my book cover since I wanted to feature some of the subjects, and I didn't want to do what most scholars who write on sex work do, which is put a half-naked woman on the book cover. I was raised by second wave feminists. So these guys were arrested in 1930. This was supposedly the end of organized prostitution in general in Buenos Aires. That's obviously wasn't exactly true, but times were changing. The country at that point went into military dictatorship, and stuff around morality really changed at that point. And the legality, this regulatory system shifted at that point. Most of these folks escaped before arrest, and 120 of them were imprisoned. They were released after about 8 months. There was no real substantial legal charges. So with that, I will stop lecturing and move into conversation.
Okay, well, an incredibly informative mere 10 minutes. Mir has raised many of the issues that I'd like to go into a little more deeply. Let's start with the term white slavery. Let me say, first of all, in general, that the book is an extraordinary effort to combine international issues because these were migrants, and also because the questions raised went all over both Europe and the Americas, and actually beyond that. Local history, this is definitely a history of Buenos Aires, and Jewish history, because the themes about Jews and sex work were relevant in many places, New York, as well as Buenos Aires. So first of all, I want to ask about the term white slavery. It's a term we don't use anymore. It was replaced by the term, and still used by the term, trafficking in women. That's the term that Emma Goldman, for instance, used. So can you talk a little about your interrogation of the term, where it came from, and how this word slavery, which we think of as associated with African agricultural unfree work, became attached to aspects of prostitution.
Yeah, so let me share my screen again because there's some really interesting images in this regard. So yeah, and, as you said, the term white slavery kind of has an afterlife in the language of traffic, and there's been some interesting scholarship examining how it is that some of the term white slavery was critiqued by people like Emma Goldman and others later for racializing both the sort of victims of white slavery and the perpetrators of white slavery. Racializing in the way that, as you can hear in the term, the underlying idea is really that there's an impossibility there to white slavery, right? Because and it was interesting because the folks, many of the activists who worked against white slavery, this is what are the major women's organizing movement transnationally, aside from suffrage, I believe, right? Dr. DuBois is the specialist on this. And many of these folks had been involved in the abolition movement against African chattel slavery. They very deliberately chose this set of terms, this juxtaposition. So one of the things I do in my book is a genealogy of this term white slavery. And I look at all the different ways in which this term was used in this time period through the sort of mid late 19th century and then its afterlife into the 20th century. And what this term did was circulate a kind of trope, a particular violent trope, a sort of often a kidnapping trope, a trope of coercion. So, for example, here are just some newspaper images from the time. You see, somebody, an impresario, shining a light on a white slave, her capture, but you also see here her incredible whiteness, also her, there's a way in which there can be sometimes a kind of salacious look at her, or certainly she is, enchained, but also dressed kind of fancy. So there's often a somewhat, I would say, pornographic gaze in some of this imagery. In other situations, there were all kinds of films and many publications in the US, Europe, and around the world, sort of warning about how different things might lead to a woman's fall into white slavery, whether it was working as a shop girl, right? Or going outside, or as it says here, dangerous amusements, the brilliant entrance to hell itself, going to a dance hall, right? So often the concept of white slavery was used as a way to, it was a kind of moral panic, right? As a way of talking about really deeper concerns about women's new entry into spaces of both work and leisure, new kinds of mobility, whether it was moving from, rural to urban areas, and then these transnational movements, right? So, um, and I mean, one of the other things that was going on was that there was a fair amount of prostitution going on, and some of it was, transnational. And I think that's the kind of thing that was hard for many people to think about as something that could have had anything agential about it. And so this was also a way of just making sense of that, this moment of massive social dislocation when you have a lot of single men traveling and a lot of demand for prostitution and then a lot of supply of prostitution. How do you talk and think about that? Yeah, and so one of the other things that I talk about in the book is the way in which Jews themselves, in a liminal racial category, end up also being racialized as part of the conversation around white slavery. And Jews were, there was this very famous League of Nations report, that two of them that came out in the mid 1920s, and a lot of the research that I've found useful for getting at some of this on the ground, really granular stuff, comes from these undercover investigations that were done through the League of Nations. And this report was criticized by Jewish community members for overrepresenting the role of Jews, or implying that Jews had a special role. And it was also criticized by some folks from South America for overrepresenting the role of South America, of Argentina. So I argue in the book that these become kind of tropes that were visible to everyone. Buenos Aires became a kind of metonym for the white slave traffic, right, as well as sex work itself. And I also argue that Jewish women are in a way racialized as, or whitened in this narrative of white slavery. If they're talked about as innocent victims, Jewish men are racialized, in the other direction, because the master of a backward slavery situation must be darkened. And often the stories about Jews that would have been told were inaccurate in the sense that they implied a white Christian victim, right? Which was not what was, that wouldn't have been happening on the ground. So yeah, and so just to be clear on the danger of this white slave story, there are multiple, as I said, particularly around race and other issues, but these also make sex workers into passive victims, right, with no decision-making power in their own lives. This is also from the League of Nations Committee. All of these stacks of paper were some of the things, you know, that I got to go through in Geneva. Um, really great archival data there. Sort of, there was this guy who went in, this guy Kinsey, and he pretended to be a trafficker himself, or wanting to start up his own brothel, and he spoke Yiddish, he spoke many languages, and so he would hang out with brothel managers, with traffickers, with madams, and talk to them about what they were doing. And so a lot of the sort of granular data that I have from Buenos Aires, he spent years in different countries, comes from his sources, mediated source, because they were also trying to, as part of these white slavery campaigns, crusade against legal regulated prostitution, right, which was the norm at that time in many places. So often these anti-traffic campaigners, anti-white slavery campaigners were trying to their abolition was the abolition of legal regulated systems, which were kind of public health systems. And they generally ultimately did, they succeeded, right? These systems of legal regulated prostitution, which had begun with the Contagious Disease Act, Josephine Butler and others, did kind of end, right, in the interwar period generally.
Just to underline a few of the things that you said in this, first of all, I found the notion of Jews as what you call the liminal racial category very helpful, that they could go dark or they could go light. And in the white slavery narrative, they did both. But that was gendered. Men were dark, women were light. Secondly, I want to emphasize the last point you made, which is these systems of legal prostitution, which were actually tried briefly in the United States, but lasted, I think, longest in France and in Argentina. These were highly critiqued by feminists because they literally, they were feminists campaigned against them because they involved the state. The government thought of itself as regulating prostitution and protecting the Johns, but feminists argued that the state was creating prostitution, that it became a state-protected form of labor. So that is, I think, very interesting and a crucial part of the Argentina story. So let me move on to another subject. You referenced that the white slavery story that was so familiar to so many portrayed the woman in the exchange as a victim. She was kidnapped, she was coerced, she was held against her will. This story is in United States history is told most frequently about Chinese prostitutes, and you challenge that, and as you say, this puts you in conjunction with certain current dialogues about prostitution or sex work. Your book starts with the story of Raquel Lieberman. She was a prostitute who came forward. And can you talk about that very interesting episode, both as it led to the beginning of the end of the Zvi Migdal Society, the Warshava Society, how it highlights the role of women. Yes, and how Raquel was portrayed and how you changed the portrait of her.
Yes, I'm going to show you Raquel, and here I've put her next to this police chief, also Garay, who was the one to whom she made her denunciation of the Varsovia Migdal Society. And so he also becomes a kind of champion. He was the police chief for the district that contained the central Jewish neighborhood of Once in downtown Buenos Aires, and he'd been kind of trying to clean up prostitution for years. And he, like most other police, was certainly an intense anti-Semite. He wrote a memoir which it was anti-Semitic in various ways, but it did distinguish the good Jews from the bad Jews. And some of the good Jews were ones like Raquel Lieberman, who was in the common story was sort of victimized, entrapped into white slavery, and then she escaped and she denounced her exploiters. And so she, in coming to the police chief, allowed a case to be built, because there really hadn't, because prostitution was legal, it was actually very difficult to, how do you clean it up? How do you, it's generally what's happening is not illegal, right? Although certainly most sex work was occurring clandestinely, was occurring outside of the regulatory system, because the burdens of that regulatory system were very onerous, right? Most people preferred to operate outside of it. So Raquel Lieberman, I mean, her name is very well known in Argentina, and it's been, there's been ongoing cultural production around her. There's been, I think documentary film that's gotten international play recently, as well as novels and plays and various other things. Her story that's sort of a heroine who turned the tables on her oppressors has really captured the imagination of, authors, activists, dramatists, filmmakers. There was an 8-hour TV miniseries produced in Argentina in 1993. There have been various, like I said, plays, novels, a South American bestseller, a poem series. There was a prize established in her honor in Buenos Aires around sort of the promoting organizations or individuals who help people get out of violence against women writ large. So Raquel Lieberman's heroism has been framed as a kind of ray of hope in the historical context of trafficked women's victimization, and as a possible model also for victims of trafficking today, right? So that's sort of how she's been held up. And so the way that I sort of turn this story on its side is, in looking at a range of sources about her, including reading carefully, including reading carefully the court transcripts, and some other archival data from later in her life, as well as sort of reading again some of the really extensive work that was done by Nora Glickman, who was able to talk to her grandchildren and get letters and other things. I have a slightly different take on her. So if you look at kind of her Yiddish correspondence with her husband, when she first came to Buenos Aires, so he had gone to Buenos Aires first, and then she came to Buenos Aires with their 2 children to meet them, and he died shortly after. And this is what initially led her into entering prostitution. At that time, she wasn't initially connected to the Varsovia Society. She didn't have a manager, quote unquote, right? Now, that story does not appear in the trial or in the popular discourse around her. She then saved up enough money to open her own antique store, which she opened in the heart of the Jewish neighborhood. So she left prostitution, opened this antique store, and leave prostitution. Then the common story at that point is that, a customer came in, this guy, Jose Solomon Korn, and that he kind of courted her, and she didn't know that he was actually a member of the Varsovia Society, and that they got married at a synagogue that was, actually maybe in that fancy mansion I just showed you, maybe that very synagogue that I showed you. There's various stories about this, and then they seem to have a fight, right? And she goes to the president of the Varsovia Society, and she says that her husband, had taken tens of thousands of pesos from her, and clothing and jewelry, and she wanted it back. So she goes to the society's president home, tries to get it all back from him. It doesn't work, right? So at that point, she goes to the police. So to me, I see a very different story here, right? Positing her really as a rational actor, demanding justice from a society that offered some conflict resolution to its members. She didn't like the conflict resolution. At that point, she went to the police. She went to at least 5 members of the society and its president before turning outward, right? She used the society's own internal structure to seek satisfaction. of the theft, right? And then when denied it, turned to state authorities. And at that point, she makes an alliance with the police. She makes an alliance with the judge. Maybe this was an act of revenge for her frustration. So generally, right, the story is that she was tricked into prostitution and managed to escape. I think it's fairly unlikely that somebody who'd already been working in prostitution in a place the size of Buenos Aires, with the Varsovia Society, as well known as it was, that she wouldn't have known that her second husband was involved in this society. That just seems incredibly unlikely. And then the fact that she was, in fact, using the mechanisms and consulting the officers within the society itself, for a process of getting her goods that, she thought were owed to her back, it tells a very different story. Furthermore, after this case plays out, right, and later on, Ezras Nashim, this sort of Jewish Women's Protection Society, the local branch of the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women, who had been kind of working with the police, they went to check up on her a couple of years later in the 1930s. They had gotten allegations of her sort of ongoing bad character. They paid a surprise visit to her house to check on her moral condition, and she was not happy about it. And her hostility to them shows up in the archival record, right? So another thing here is like, well, why was she so unhappy to see them if they had rescued her earlier, which is sort of the story is one of her having been rescued, right? So some of the things I draw from this are also the way in which this Jewish mainstream organization collaborated with even anti-Semitic officials like the police commissioner, also Gorai, and then also this sort of ongoing antagonism with their star witness, right? We see the mainstream Jewish community's temporarily mutually beneficial relationship with Argentine authorities around the issue of Jewish sex work management. We also see highlighted here the minimal amount of rescue from coerced traffic that was ever achieved by international and local organizations. This is something that I see over and over again reading these, international reports, local reports. Like they could hardly ever rescue anyone. Why? Well, it might be because they were entrapped with such intense violence. It might be because there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of other options for them to have. It may be because they also didn't trust these organizations, right? There's all kinds of reasons. But all of them do speak against, this sort of victim narrative, right? And the victim narrative itself is useful to various, people in various positions, right? If you're a rescuer, let's say you're an international, women's organization, feminist organization, Jewish, saving women organization, you get to rescue women, and that looks pretty good. It doesn't sound so great to talk about this modified choice theory, to talk about women making morally compromised positions. It doesn't sound so great to talk about all the Jewish men who are involved in pimping, in sex work and management. So anyway, I could go on about that forever, but that's sort of the central contours of the argument I make about Raquel Lieberman in the book.
Let me make two comments before going on to another theme. One is I was really struck that when you talk about the sub-community of people involved in the sex industry, I think the only two individuals who are really named and explored. Oh, hi, Raquel.
Yeah, sorry. I meant to show you her and her sons later in life. Not that late.
Does she still has descendants who won't talk to you? Is that right?
I mean, I didn't try to reach out to her grandchildren. Nora Glickman did a bunch of work with them, wrote a book. I've heard various things about their desire to do this, but certainly the story that they were involved in telling was not this story.
Actually, before I go on to my points, I couldn't remember what's the name of the English language novel about these things, about the rubbing off the cemetery.
The Ministry of Special Cases. Nathan.
By
Englander.
Yeah, that's when I first.
It's not about that, but it has an opening scene. It's sort of set during the dictatorship of the 70s. And it starts where people are, sort of hired thugs are gouging the names out of these gravestones to try to erase the memory, right, of their ancestors.
And they're hired by the descendants of the people whose graves are in this cemetery.
Yeah.
So I did have a couple of thoughts about this important story. First of all, as you were speaking, it seemed to me that the theme and the issues surrounding trafficking in women, which still is an issue, but not at the same level, has sort of migrated into the international campaign, the campaign that has an international dimension against violence against women. It has some of the same themes, and it also plays an outside role in modern, both in feminism itself and certainly in the way that governments are willing to engage with feminism. And it is it raises some of the same difficulties of distinguishing between what's actually happening to women and from sort of who was actually profiting from this campaign. So I thought that was interesting. Okay.
So before you move on to
Sure.
I don't know if you're about to move on, but I wanted to add to what you just said, which is that there are some very strange bedfellows in these current movements and sort of political alliances. The evangelical right is also very involved, and a lot of these anti-trafficking organizations international are funded by the evangelical right. And I mean, the domestic violence movement allied itself with the police in this country, several decades ago, right? So these are strange bedfellows, right? These are strange bedfellows. And the anti-trafficking language, so there are a lot of critiques of what these anti-trafficking organizations do, from that they really don't rescue people. They don't actually deal with any of the root causes, poverty, lack of opportunity. They don't give people new networks to be involved in, because often these are family networks, these are community networks. They can't offer something else. They don't offer something else. They offer a rescue, which, then doesn't go on for a whole heck of a long time. There are certain people who speak very movingly about their stories, but some of what's so moving about that story is the way that it lines up with particular kinds of moral norms, certain notions of rescue, of who is deserving, of who is undeserving, and of gender and power. So again, looking at the ways in which both in this country and internationally, organizations function and legal restrictions function, this all tends to, on the ground, make things worse for people involved in sex work, whether they're trans women, cisgender women, other people in sex work, tend to be the ones on whom these new restrictions backfire, on the ground.
I do think it's very complicated. I guess I would also say that the sex worker defending themselves side also has severe limitations. And it really depends on what kind of community. If you're talking about the United States or France, or for that matter, Argentina, the implications are one thing. If you're talking about India, the implications are quite different. But we could go on and on about this. Actually, I was going to raise something a little later, but I'll just mention it now. I was thinking of your book, Mir, when I was listening to the growing scandal around Congressman Gates. And he is being charged with, or he hasn't been charged yet, but he is on the verge of being charged with some other lovely Florida creatures with trafficking in women. And I notice when when they're interviewed by journalists, they're quite confused. They often think that prostitution is illegal. They think that prostitution involves federal law, which it doesn't. And it's very hard to actually outlaw prostitution, because what are you going to outlaw certain kinds of sex? You're going to outlaw transfers of money. So a lot of this comes down to underage women. But anyhow, if you listen to the new news coming out about this, I think you'll see some of the same themes that Mir has raised.
Well, and also the issue of minors and sort of what is sex work, right? So often that was exactly what was happening in the research the League of Nations and others were doing in the 1920s, for example. They were looking for minors because that was the line that they could draw, right? They could try to find out how old people were. That's much easier than trying to figure out, well, is what they're doing actually sex work, especially if sex work is not illegal. But what is sex work, right? And, I teach the work of a friend of mine who is actually a Christian pastor who's worked in a harm reduction field with sex workers for many decades. And she, I think drawing from activists, uses the phrase, so what is sex work? Sex work is trading sex for something that you need. So that is a very different interpretation of what is sex work than the kind of Julia Roberts Pretty Woman image of like, we know what a sex worker is. It's, somebody walking down the street doing particular acts, a particular kind of person. But if you define it more broadly, and certainly in the era of the internet, it has to be defined much more broadly, but it becomes very slippery to define who is and who is not engaging in sex work, right? Because the same act that might be illegal when it's not on camera becomes legal if it's pornography, right? So, I mean, these things are, as you're saying, incredibly complicated. And, I'd also say about minors, that becomes a way of also having a clear victim, right? Because there's no way that somebody who's 17, right, or 16, or obviously 12, 13, 11, could possibly have any agency. But sex worker organizations themselves also make the point that, like, those ages mean different things for different people in different contexts. That's obviously not to say, the exploitation of a child is acceptable, but also that, teenagers may be exercising some agency. But I think also when we talk about agency, I think we tend to really elaborate it to be something that is far more extensive than certainly I and many others want to say that it is. It's not, I've certainly met some feminists who feel very empowered by stripping or some other aspect of sex work, but that actually isn't what I mean in most cases. I don't mean that somebody necessarily sees themselves as a feminist or even, experiences themselves as super powerful. It's that all of their agency and decision making hasn't been taken away from them, right? And I actually think, Ellen, what you're saying about India, I think that distinction between East and West is also often exploited in a very orientalizing gaze around where white Western feminists want to save the more oppressed brown women in other parts of the world. And there's a lot of work on this, right? So, well, they must be more exploited because their lives are so horrible. No, they, in many cases, also may have some choices. They are probably not great choices. They do not have all the choices, right? But I think it's actually that framing is used in ways that end up playing out in very problematic ways.
Well, since we can't go on forever, I'm going to move on to a third theme. In the book and in your presentation, you talk about the battle between mainstream Jews and the impure, the Tamim, as helping to shape the Buenos Aires Jewish community. And particularly after the battle, the trial that Raquel Lieberman's case initiates in 1930, I think it is. Can you elaborate that? And then also, I was really struck with, I think, one of the intentions of your book, which is that this story is usually told as one of Jews versus anti-Semites. And I would like you to maybe elaborate your decision to look at internal conflicts in the Jewish community as opposed to a uniform defense by Jews of the hostilities that come to them from the outside.
Yeah, so for this last section, I want to maybe take you guys a little bit into sort of Argentina in what's sometimes called its golden age. As sometimes, as we've talked about, this is a very well-known story among Argentine Jews, too well-known, source of shame, right? It's often framed as unknown or a silent story in other spaces, or it's exoticized by scholars and journalists with an audience beyond Latin America, because look, you have these two exotic, sexy things, Latin America and sex, and Jews, all really sexy and exotic, right? So, historians—
Jews are sexy? I'm sorry.
Okay. It depends who you're asking. So, historians of Argentine Jewry in response, right, have tried to minimize this topic. And so when they've talked about it, it's sort of mentioning the issue of Jewish participation and the mainstream Jewish community's opposition as either kind of a colorful footnote or a shameful footnote, or maybe a triumphalist footnote, depending on the approach, to what's more important in Jewish life, kind of formal institutional formation, maybe institutions, synagogues, cultural life, right? The Jewish gauchos, the sort of rural communities, right? So what I'm arguing here is that this battle and this kind of temporary overrepresentation of Ashkenazim in sex work in Argentina was actually a central force in shaping the identity and the organizational development of what was really a very important and large Jewish community. At many points in the 20th century, this was the fifth largest Jewish community in the world. So, we got to think also about Buenos Aires in a slightly different way than probably many of us do. In the late 19th, early 20th century, Buenos Aires was sort of similar to New York City in many ways, right? Economically, it's right being a sort of city of immigrants. I don't want to take it too far, but the usual version of Argentine history centers on this success of Buenos Aires in this period. It's explosive growth. It's sort of the European modeling and Europeanized population, but then the tragedy of the later military authoritarian governments, which really started in 1930, and sort of economic decline, right? The tragedy of Argentina. So, one of the aspects of early 20th century Argentina was a gender imbalance, which was common in frontier societies, right? There was this period where most of the population was foreign born, and men among that population outnumbered women by nearly 2-1. So this was, as I mentioned before, a situation with a lot of demand for sex work, and then the particular ways in which it was regulated and the sort of various dynamics made the city gain a real international reputation as, kind of a Vegas type of space for sex workers. And as I argue, one of the things that was also happening was that it would draw women who were already working in prostitution in less lucrative places, where emigration of men fed a decrease in brothel prostitution opportunities. But anyway, just to get to the internal sort of conflict, right? So Buenos Aires, again, they were built on the Parisian model. Elites looked to Europe intellectually, artistically. A middle class was starting to grow at this time, right? But, these were tenuous gains, and much of the Buenos Aires Jewish community as it developed was fairly conservative socially, and in part in reaction to fears of anti-Semitism. Certainly, in conversations around immigration, the desirability of Jews was questioned, right? And Jeff Lesser has done really interesting work on this in Brazil as well. Renan Ryan and others have done really great work also looking at Jews and culture more recently. We talked about the legal regulation of prostitution. Oh, sorry, I'm just on a few tangents because you all need to know that the tango started in these brothels. And this is a really total tangent, but the tango started as a dance between men. There is a homoerotic history of the tango. You see these guys dancing together because they were waiting in the brothels because there were so many men. They had to wait to get into women, and what they did was kind of get each other heated up, and that's also, you see it as kind of a dance fight. You could think about the roots of that there a little bit. All right, so in this city, this is some mapping work that I did for the book based on census data, sort of populations within brothel sites, right? So this map shows the area of downtown Buenos Aires that became in 1890s the location of the Jewish street, right? I circle on the underlying map in orange, the neighborhood was called Once 11 for the 11th of September train station. This was where the new Jewish immigrant community concentrated. So what I'm showing you here with these dots is sort of locations of the ways in which brothels with large numbers of Jewish women were really concentrated in the heart of the Jewish district. And this is very early in this community's growth and migration, right? There was the involvement of Jews in prostitution was visible to everyone, especially to other Jews, right? As well as the potential wealth available in that line of work, which, the streets weren't actually paved with gold for a lot of other folks. People didn't want to show up and be like used clothes peddlers as they often had to do, right? There was one local Jewish observer who said that when new arrivals who'd been recruited by this Jewish Colonization Association came to the Buenos Aires docks, it's like 1891, that there were these madams in fancy furs and men in flashy suits kind of calling to women as they got off the boats, come join us, right? So I don't know if that happened or not, but you get the concept, right? What's happening for a reason. And one of the things I do argue, in contrast to some of the defensiveness of some other historians, is that I think numbers are hard to get, but I think that Ashkenazi Jews were disproportionately involved for this period in the management and practice of prostitution, and certainly very visibly involved. So I found in the center of this neighborhood, I won't say, a one block concentration of over 200 Jewish women in brothels in this one block. This was not a legal red light district. This was like a functional concentration that happened to be in the symbolic heart of the Jewish district, right? So this really, as you might imagine, upsets the other new immigrants who are seeking respectability, who want a different image of themselves, right? So I do other mapping for later in time. This is from 1920s data, and here I'm mapping, sort of both sites that are kind of brothels, but also other kinds of headquarters, meeting sites, residences, cafes, cabarets, other addresses associated with the Varsovia Society and their networks. And then I also note here sort of the symbolic center of the Jewish district, which is basically where that 200 woman brothel concentration was, 25 years earlier, and no, 35 years earlier. But also the way in which many Jews by this point were starting to move out of the city center, but this continued to be in many ways kind of the heart of Jewish Buenos Aires. And Jewish sex work continued to be very visible through this entire time period in that area. And other kinds of organizations were also located there, including sort of headquarters of various mainstream Jewish institutions, as well as Jewish anti-prostitution institutions. They were all mixed together in close quarters, right? So one of the things that I'm arguing is how the legacy of this fight, right? So one of the other interesting things that I found in the archives was that this sort of mainstream Jewish anti-prostitution organization, Esnos Nashim, continued its work even after the Varsovia Society was dismantled in 1930, and prostitution was made illegal in 1937. And through this period of military dictatorship of the 30s, there's increasing repression on this sort of work. But at that point, they were kind of riding high off of their success with this court case, and there was certainly conflict within the community about whether or not this organization should have power, prestige, etc. But they tried to ensure the Jewish future and the legitimacy of the community through restrictions on marriage. They created a system in the mid-1930s of morality certificates, which they had to certify. And they were basically trying to make it so that Jewish marriages were limited unless both the bride and the groom could certify that they didn't have any past involvement with the Tameim, right? So they were trying to control the Jewish future through kind of getting in between who could get married in the future, right? So in general, I would say about this boycott, its legacy, in many ways, it's been successful. We think about that locked cemetery in ruins, right? The way in which the particular story told about this history has almost always been this white slavery victimization narrative. But I argue here that, we might want to think differently about the central role of the history of sex work in shaping, the current structure of the Buenos Aires Jewish community, which is very centralized institutionally. So there was a way in which there was this institutional centralization that occurred at that point in 1930, where a bunch of organizations that did not get along with each other beforehand got together to fight this, right? Because they all agreed collectively, this is bad for the Jews. This is something we can do to clean up our reputation in the face of the anti-Semites. And I think this also may have something to do with certain aspects of the relative conservatism of this community, not making it causal, but the two things are obviously interconnected. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we're probably near the end of our time. I just want to ask, I am assuming that Jews no longer play a major role in an industry that still exists.
As far as I understand, that is true.
And do you attribute that to, I know you don't write about this, but do you think that that's a result of these battles? Is it a result of the upward mobility of the Jewish community? Is it a result of the eventual entry of other immigrants with the same kinds of needs that the initial roles of immigrants played, Jewish immigrants played? Have you thought about, I guess what I'm trying to get at as we finish is, if this story is about Jews and sex work in general, and you have successfully, I think, taken apart and replaced and created a more open-ended narrative of Jews and sex work in this period, 1890 to 1930. What's your way of talking about what's going on now? Are we missing the role of Jews in sex work? If sex work no longer involves Jews in a visible and disproportionate way, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, so here I do need to plead being a historian in that, like, I don't know what contemporary numbers are, um, you know, but here I will come back to the question of what is sex work. So the kind of sex work that I'm looking at in this book is a particular form. It's organized and structured in a particular way. I have no idea what the numbers are today of, I don't know, Jews involved in the range of sex work that currently exists online, right? But if we're thinking about really survival sex, right? Survival level sex, that's always going to be something that folks generally engage in who have very few other options, right? Who structurally, usually for multiple intersectional reasons, have very few other options, right? So if we think about how Jews have a broader range of options in a general way, and I'm just going to generalize about all Jews. Obviously, this is different depending on different sectors of different Jewish populations, different communities, different places. But yeah, I mean, like you were saying about upward mobility, there's a difference between a population being concentrated in particular professions and also the network. A lot of it is about the networks, right? So what was going on here was this was a business with networks. There were relatives where, brothers had brothels together and worked together in sometimes there was sometimes family intergenerational entry. So it's also, I think, often in this kind of sex work about family networks. Who knows whom, what kind of work are you going to end up in? Just like other kinds, how do you decide where to go when you're migrating? How do you decide what kind of work you're in, right? So those kinds of networks are going to look different at different times depending on what kinds of work those groups are doing. So I would add that into your analysis, as well as, yeah, just thinking about in which situations do women or do transgender people who, with a range of identities want, so what are the other options available and for whom and where, as well as also, what does sex work look like today?
I guess I would sort of back away from my original um, question to say I think in some ways this book can stand as a warning against assuming, what is the modern Jew? The image of the modern Jew is one that comes um, from the work that you describe of institutions. Bernie Madoff died yesterday. And I don't know, I've been familiar with Mir's work for a long time, but this conversation has raised many, many issues for me. And it will for you. So thanks, Mir. Good luck in your future work. I'm sure it will be every bit as path-breaking as this.
Thank you. And folks are welcome to reach out to me at Wake Forest University. I'm easy enough to find. And yeah, look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks very much.